we'll get started. I'm Sarah Curitan. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and it's my great honor to welcome you to this lunchtime Lunch and Learn program. We have two terrific speakers for you this afternoon, and I do want to mention that this program is all part of the many different activities we have connected to Revolution NJ, which you see behind me here, our statewide initiative to mark the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And we have two wonderful, very learned and popular speakers to talk about two particular topics that do relate to our ongoing exploration of the American Revolution, particularly in connection to memory and today preservation as well. So with that, let me introduce and mention that we have two wonderful speakers. Paul Soltis is here, and he's going to share the 19th and 20th century debates surrounding the preservation of George Washington's final wartime headquarters. And then our second speaker, John Fabiano, who will explore the life and legacy of Sarah Smith Stafford, who was either the custodian of valuable revolutionary artifacts or an early American fraud. So we're excited to hear from both of our speakers. Again, thank you all for joining us, and do plan to join us later in the fall for our big New Jersey History Conference, where we'll have even more presentations exploring this whole area of history and memory. And with that, let me turn it over to Rachel Timke to launch our program.
Hi, thank you so much, Sarah. We are so excited to have everyone here with us today. As Sarah mentioned, this is both a part of Revolution NJ, as well as our 2025 New Jersey History Conference. So if you like what you hear from our speakers today, we really welcome you to come back and join us on October 30th at the College of New Jersey for our conference on memory and memorialization. With that, I will introduce our first speaker today. As Sarah mentioned, we have Paul Soltis with us, who is the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's historian for the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage historic sites, George Washington's Middlebrook headquarters, and the historic home of the founder and first president of Rutgers in Somerville. Paul interprets New Jersey's early national and religious diversity and the American Revolution in New Jersey, in addition to contributing to Revolution NJ, which is New Jersey's official partnership to commemorate America's 250th. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Paul.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel, and the Historical Commission. Unmute, okay. It's exciting. All right, here we go. It's exciting to be able to sort of be part of this teaser kickoff to the conference next month. So yeah, thanks again to you all. And as Rachel introduced, my name's Paul. I'm the historian for the Department of Environmental Protection's State Historic Sites at Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage in Somerville. The Old Dutch Parsonage is, as Rachel said, the historic home of the founder and first president of Rutgers, constructed in 1751 for ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church in the Merton River Valley of New Jersey. And the neighboring historic home on our kind of dual state historic site property in Somerville is the Wallace House, which is itself nearly 250 years old, built in the opening years of the Revolutionary War in 1776 into 1777, most significant for its use just after its construction as the headquarters for George Washington during the Middlebrook Cantonment of the Revolutionary War. Washington himself in headquarters in the Wallace House for 2 weeks in December of 1778, and then again for several months from February through June of 1779 as part of this larger Middlebrook cantonment. which includes several historic homes also surviving in the region today. We work together and promote as part of our Middlebrook Consortium of Historic Sites. But as today, and this conference theme relates particularly not only to the history itself, but to the preservation and the memory, I want to share in particular, not so much the history of the American Revolution at the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage, as the early history, at least, of the preservation of Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage for their significance to the American Revolution, but exploring the kind of process and motivations behind the early preservation of these historic homes. For the Wallace House in 1897, for the Old Dutch Parsonage about a decade later in 1913, and how that informs our efforts today to look after and preserve them, and our efforts to rehabilitate and revitalize them as part of these anniversaries and Revolution NJ. The Wallace House, as I mentioned, is nearly 250 years old. We will celebrate its 250th birthday later this fall. I don't have an exact day, so I'm using the day that John Wallace of Philadelphia purchased the property, December the 7th of 1775. It would serve as Washington's headquarters, as we mentioned, during this Middlebrook Cantonment in 78 to 79, and then it remains a private farmhouse, really, up until the 1890s, when a group forms for the preservation of historic landmarks related to the Revolutionary War. But this group initially is not looking at the Wallace House, it's looking at another headquarters of George Washington in Somerset County. The Revolutionary Memorial Society of New Jersey really begins in earnest on April the 14th of 1896 in a gathering of preservationists in an office at the Prudential Building, the Prudential headquarters in Newark, New Jersey. And the records of this organization today are at the New Jersey Historical Society. So I want to make sure I'm citing from those sources for the records of the early Revolutionary Memorial Society. But this group at that time, on April 14th, as the name they adopted as their provisional title at that meeting suggests, really had one specific object in mind: the Association for Preservation of Washington's headquarters at Rocky Hill, the Berrien Mansion. The illustration here on the left comes from Benson Lossing's pictorial field book of the American Revolution. That could be a whole nother day's seminar in preservation and memory, but these historic sites recorded in the mid-19th century related to the Revolutionary War of the so-called Berrien Mansion, the home of the Berrien family at the time of the American Revolution, which would serve as Washington's final wartime headquarters from August to November of 1783, while the Treaty of Paris was adopted both in Paris, and then also the news of the treaty reached the Congress at that time meeting in Princeton. Among the members of this kind of gathering at the Prudential Building in Newark in April of 1896 is listed Miss Kate McFarland of Rocky Hill. She is the important link to this effort to specifically not only preserve historic landmarks, but specifically preserve the Berrien Mansion. She is the only participant in this meeting who is a resident of Rocky Hill. So she appears to have a particular local affinity to this house. And interestingly, I just thought to note, talking about preservation movement, she is the only one in the record of the meeting who is not listed with, who's listed without lineage postnominals. So what I mean by that is everyone who attends this gathering are listed with a DAR or SAR or SR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, the Sons of the Revolution. These lineage organizations that were really established and forming in the late 19th century for people with a genealogical descent from patriots, those who had fought in the Revolutionary War and could trace an ancestral connection to them. And these lineage organizations in particular are big movers of this early effort to preserve sites related to the early American history, particularly the American Revolution, across the United States and including New Jersey. So I thought kind of notable that Miss Kate McFarland does not have any affiliations on her name listed there, but shows someone without a direct ancestral claim also beginning to enter the world of preservation in this period. When they meet again in May of 1896, they plan to meet again and incorporate themselves as the Washington Headquarters Association at Rocky Hill. The associators organize a special train, which is kind of a cool insight into the logistics of these gatherings in the late 19th century, so that anyone who's coming from Newark or Monmouth Junction can get a special train out to Princeton and onwards from there to Rocky Hill to visit the Berrien Mansion. And one of the themes I want to share too is these curious resemblances, maybe. I think often when we talk about preservation today, it can seem these projects are so daunting now, whereas unlike sort of back in the day when there was so much support and there was so much interest to conduct these projects, well, when you start trying to find where back in the day was, you find a lot of the same quirks and challenges of preservation back then that we experience today. So a few days later, they had to clarify, oh, we can't meet at the house because we don't have permission. So this group, hoping to preserve the house, planned to hold their meeting there and had to backtrack, realizing actually no one talked to the owner. So kind of the passion preceding the organization for preserving the Berrien Mansion. But they would rearrange their meeting from May until June, and they found a space to meet at Dickinson Hall in Princeton, of course, on the campus of what is now Princeton University. At this gathering, the association debates a formal name for themselves, maybe an early indication that they're kind of shifting from just looking at one particular house to taking a larger approach. One proposal is the New Jersey Society of the Revolution. One proposal is the Revolutionary Memorial Society of New Jersey. Another member proposes expanding that to Colonial and Revolutionary Society, kind of expanding the scope of time period that they're considering significant. But Revolutionary Memorial Society is the name chosen, and is here on an emblem of the society from the following year, 1897, but tracing their origin to 1896. But the debate takes place because, although well-meaning, they realize they might not be able to purchase and buy the Berrien Mansion, the house that today we call Rockingham. The meeting opens resolved with a proposal from the president of the association that we decline to accept the Berrien Mansion if removed from its present historic site on any terms whatever. The Berrien Mansion at Rocky Hill was now part of the Rocky Hill Quarry Company's holdings on top of the Rocky Hill, right, for which the village takes its name. And the Rocky Hill was being quarried by the late 19th century. And the Quarry Company, although willing to part with the historic house itself, was not prepared to part with the land on which it sat. They were interested in continuing to expand their operations over time. And so the preservation of the house on its original location was not acceptable to the Quarry Company that held it in ownership. So perhaps another in-theme preservationists who have great ideas, and then when it comes up to questions of, well, who actually has the ownership, the rights to make these decisions, they can be different than what's expected. And largely out of this first meeting comes the opinion of the organization that their opinion is unanimous against the building being removed from its original site. They say that so doing would take away all historic interest from it, and that it is the spot more than the house that should be preserved. Really interesting for a meeting in 1896, talking about we're interested not only in the preservation of this historic house, but actually in the landscape on which it sits. They're not quite using that terminology. And I'll get to why that's significant in a moment. And as a result, the organization starts to look around, and they send out scouts to look for other houses. Well, if we can't have the Berrien Mansion, we'll look elsewhere. And New Jersey, of course, is rich in not only historic homes of the Revolutionary War, but even Washington's headquarters, right? Washington spends more time in New Jersey than any other colony in the American Revolution. And so by August, there's another meeting follow up at the Wallace House, it's called, in Somerville, New Jersey. And a lot of the local leaders of Somerville society join this gathering, hosting representatives of the new Revolutionary Memorial Society, encouraging them to take on the preservation of the Wallace House as their organization's major project. The society decides to adopt the Wallace House as its project. And when they begin fundraising efforts, I do think it's kind of one of the details interesting to note in their fundraising letters is they compare the effort that they are proposing to undertake to the recent effort to preserve Washington's headquarters at Morristown. We know as the Ford Mansion, today part of Morristown National Historical Park, but the preservation of the Ford Mansion begun earlier by the Washington Society of New Jersey. So kind of interesting to see these different groups in conversation with each other. They said, hey, this has worked out before. This group in Morristown preserved the Ford Mansion. It's become this great attraction. We can do the same thing here with this headquarters of Washington, a few miles to the south in Somerville. By the following year, in 1897, the society had obtained title to the Wallace House from the last private family to live there. And in June of 1897 would hold opening exercises, officially opening the Wallace House as a historic site for people to visit. The opening weekend of the Wallace House coincided with the Diamond Jubilee, interestingly, of Queen Victoria, 60 years for the British monarch. And so here is the Somerville newspaper that weekend, or that Thursday, I guess, reporting on the joint observances of the opening of the Wallace House and the sermon on Queen Victoria's reign that was preached that weekend as well at the Reformed Church. But although the society officially moved on to the Wallace House project, among its members were dissenters who felt, well, just because we can't buy the property doesn't mean that the Berrien Mansion, doesn't mean that Rockingham House isn't worth saving in its own right. The Somerset County Historical Quarterly would include a report from Miss Kate McFarlane about a decade later in 1912, where she explains the process by which she, in effect, led a dissenting group that said, no, just because we can't buy the property does not mean buying the house itself is not worthwhile. In particular, Kate McFarlane explains her reasoning in this passage here. She reaches out to, and works closely with another local preservationist, Mrs. Josephine Thompson Swan. Again, just because I noticed in that first record of the Revolutionary Memorial Society, she's the only member who does not have a lineage affiliation attributed to her. It's interesting that Kate McFarlane also in this summary of the preservation of the Rockingham House mentions that she reached out to Mrs. Thompson Swan because she is a daughter of the American Revolution, in quotation marks. And this kind of lends a kind of legitimacy, a support to her efforts. So although she herself cannot trace her ancestry to any revolutionary patriot, she brings on a daughter of the American Revolution, capital DAR, to support the effort. But importantly here to the changing approaches to preservation is her point that we felt we had gained a great deal when the price was settled upon the house, as it was the house we were wishing to preserve and not the site. Rather innocuous sentence on its own, but if you understand what happened 12 years ago preceding this purchase, it makes sense. What she's trying to do is explain her reasoning. The rest of the group disagreed with her. They said, no point saving the house if you can't have the land. She says, I think it's still worth it. And so she splinters off on her own and kind of establishes a new organization, the Washington Headquarters Association of Rocky Hill. And this organization will carry out the preservation of the Rockingham House. It is for this reason, incidentally, that Rockingham is included on the New Jersey Women's Heritage Trail, not for its 18th century history, but for the role of these two women in the preservation of the historic house in the 1890s. And the reason I always found that line from Miss McFarland so interesting is think about these changing approaches to preservation over time. And for how I frame it, I'm going to borrow here from Professor Carl Lounsbury and the architectural historians of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, who in their kind of history of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's own architectural research and preservation, have kind of distinguished these efforts at the preservation of landmarks and landscapes, and largely using that kind of phrasing to explain the shift that occurs from largely these colonial revival preservation movement of the 1800s and early 1900s. And then around mid-century, this kind of shift into, although it itself has had changes, the new historical approach that is largely what we take in historic preservation today. In defense of Kate McFarland, right, we might say by allowing the Rockingham House to move, we have lost so much in terms of the landscape, the archaeology. But that wasn't a problem to her because these weren't things that she was even aware of or interested in. Historical archaeology itself doesn't really come in until the early 1900s, largely a result of efforts of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. In this era, archaeology is something you do for either ancient history, right? The ancient world that is not recorded in documents, or what, at least to the Western schools that are studying these things, are foreign or exotic subjects, right? So people of, the South Pacific, for whom there is no Western record, documented record, one conducts archaeology to kind of understand their ways of life and their ways of thinking. Colonial Williamsburg brings together this idea that, well, we can do both. We can take periods where we have documents, and then we can also study the archaeology. And frankly, that also expands the social interests, right? Because, as Dr. Lounsbury posits, when one is looking at landmarks, one is generally interested, of course, in the great men in particular that inhabited the places. When one turns to landscapes, it opens up understanding the whole variety of people who comprise the past. And in the case of a Washington's headquarters, of course, preserving the landmark offers the opportunity to preserve Washington, the commander-in-chief, imparting kind of this virtue or leadership as a model for the American to follow. Turning to landscape allows for a full understanding of Washington's headquarters as a full operation, including the Mrs. Washington as at his side, including the enslaved people from Mount Vernon, Billy Lee, who is Washington's valet during the Revolutionary War, the maids traveling with Martha Washington, including the headquarters staff, enslaved and hired, white and black servants working in and around the house, and the soldiers and military presence that make it all possible. So I like to just bring up Kate McFarland's approach in comparison to understand. And also, although Kate McFarland, we might regret that she allowed the removal of the house from its historic context, curiously, the Revolutionary Memorial Society, although they made a big point that they wanted the land itself, were open to modification of the land because they also aren't quite thinking in these new historical ways that we often approach today. They'll carry out the construction of a caretaker's cottage next door to the Wallace House, itself a beautiful work of the arts and crafts movement. And so from their perspective, they're adding to the historical interest of the property. Largely, the motivator of this early preservation movement is in a new industrial age, we want to get closer to the historical methods and techniques. We want to show off nails and shingles and all these things. So an arts and crafts cottage, it's not from the 18th century, but it's pulling out the themes that are interesting to them. They would also construct a neighborhood in the backyard, effectively, of the Wallace House, along, of course, the street named for it, the headquarters, Washington Place. And so where all the outbuildings and real rich world of the people working at the Wallace House during Washington's headquarters existed, they're not thinking about archaeology, right? They're not thinking about searching for these places or things. They put up, new homes along this area, allowing them to help fund their preservation effort of the landmark, right, of the Wallace House. Although in fairness to them, I do see in the records of the society references at least up to the 1920s to an old barn. So there's kind of a notion of there are some outbuildings and structures worth preserving. The old barn appears to vanish at some point, and I need to do further research to see when exactly that happens, whether by intention or by neglect. And in fairness to these organizations, though, I say for them, in what was such a rural, agricultural New Jersey of the 1900s, 1910s, the notion that you'd have to preserve a barn at some point probably sounded like we have to preserve, a Starbucks today, right? These are just so omnipresent, these buildings or a convenience store, right? Or warehouse, maybe, they're everywhere. In what universe would these ever be necessary of preservation? So these kind of outlying elements lost to us today because of these changes over time. And one element to point out too is their interest in new materials. So curiously, while they are so interested in the past because of the old materials they feel are vanishing, they're excited to share the new materials. And you can see very proudly listed here on the Historic American Building Survey, the asbestos roof that was installed to kind of bring this old house up to modern parlance. So I just wanted to share all these to kind of introduce these ideas of how these understanding the decisions that they made 100 to 125 years ago helps us understand the approaches that we can take today as we carry out our ongoing rehabilitation of the Wallace House. Help fill in these cracks that are coming through the building now and bring new approaches to understanding and preserving these buildings. There's so much, I've went along even more. There's so much more to share, but I appreciate you all joining me for that little look. And I'll let Rachel take over and bring John in for the next part.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that wonderful presentation. It was really interesting to hear both all the ways that preservation feels so similar today, but also the ways that are different. For folks who have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or into the Q&A section. We're going to wait until the end of both presentations to take those questions, but please feel free to, drop them in as you're thinking about them, and we'll read them out after John Fabiano, who I will now introduce to you all. So John Fabiano is the recently retired Executive Director of Monmouth County Historical Commission. Currently, he is a trustee of both the Friends of Monmouth Battlefield and Old Yellow Meeting House, and a member of the Washington Crossing American Revolution Roundtable. In addition, he volunteers at the Allentown Public Library as resident archivist and historian. Thank you so much for being with us today, John.
It's my pleasure, Rachel. Let's get started. It's a long, it'll be a short program. I could go on for a while, as most of you folks know. Today, my talk is about Sarah Smith Stafford. She's quite an enigma. This picture of her is pretty much how she appeared to many people in reading the histories about her. Charles R. Hutchison, a local businessman and historian who chronicled the history of Allentown in these ledgers back in the end of the 19th century.
Hi, John. I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you mind sharing your screen?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. There we go. And now I got to get the toolbar moved so I could get to the program. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Everybody see her?
Looks great.
Great. Thank you. Again, Sarah Smith Stafford. Charles Robbins Hutchinson, in his collections and papers at the New Jersey Historical Society, which is an incredible resource for us in Allentown to learn about all these individuals that inhabited our past here. He refers to Sarah in this way. Says that probably no one in Allentown has ever so generally been disliked as the Stafford family. Among the old people who remember them, I've never found one who would say a good word for any of them. Although Stafford claimed to be and probably was an Englishman by birth, his neighbors always insisted on calling him an Irishman. The family consisted of himself, his wife, and 3 children, and they were commonly mentioned as Pa and Ma Stafford, Sister Sarah, and dear little Samuel. Now, he doesn't look too kindly on Sarah, and it could be because they grew up in a very prejudiced time, especially against the Irish. In fact, they pejoratively put Patty and Shirley's images and hung them on a tree in front of the house, which would really annoy old man Stafford. But old man Stafford had quite a Revolutionary War career that Sarah herself really never quite gave her father credit for, although she carried the Revolutionary War memory forward. And it's said of her that she was clad in a petticoat of red, white, and blue. She wore her patriotism with pride and sincerity. She was custodian of many valuable relics of the Revolution, as well as the only person of her sex at this time to have been honored with the membership in the New Jersey Historical Society. I think that was around 1860 or so. Sarah, let me go forward here. Sarah famously claimed in her, she at one time produced a memoir. They were that well off that this was produced during her own lifetime. Here's an image of her father, Lieutenant Stafford. He was brought to Allentown in 1797 to be a tutor at the Allentown Academy. The Allentown Academy had been established as early as 1782 with subscriptions from some of the most notable people in New Jersey at that time. It was recruited by the Presbyterian minister. At that time, it wasn't. It was part of the church, and he taught there for 7 years. He was also a justice of the peace here and postmaster in Allentown, so he was quite a notable fellow. Here's the Presbyterian Church in Allentown I was referring to. The Academy building is just to the left of that. In fact, it was reconstructed in the 20th century so that there's a twin matching it exactly. It's a very interesting architectural feature. The whole hill up here where I live, I'm very fortunate when I moved to Allentown. I was not a historian at that time, most of you folks know, but living here and studying this town's history has just brought me the fulfillment of my life, to tell you the truth. Now, Sarah claimed through Reverend Swain's centennial address here that, moreover, from it was said that Molly Pitcher, who at the Battle of Monmouth acted the role of cannoneer in place of her husband or other brave soldier who had fallen beside his gun, reputed to have been the daughter of one John Hannah, was of North Ireland extraction and had been at times serving maid in the family of Captain James Bruere. And she was perhaps the wife of a soldier named John Mabon. Now, as most of you know, some of you know, I've spent the last 20, 25 years trying to determine if this fact is true. Here's an that is Malone Carter image of Molly, very famous at the gun. Most of you are familiar with that. And here is an account from 1876 from the Freehold transcript. And it exactly explains Sarah Stafford's story about Molly Pitcher. It's claiming that she was the daughter of John Hannah. She was an Irish Presbyterian, had another daughter named Betty. And then she goes on to this very vernacular type of speech, referring to relatives and again, repeating that she was a servant girl in the household of Bruere, and that her father was one of the Irish redemptioners that came to redeem the cost of the travel across the sea. and were held in servitude for a while. And then she claims the name Pitcher has to do with the same old image of Molly with the cannon, and then repeats the name Mabon again. Now, Mabon, if said phonetically, could sound an awful lot like the woman or the individual that we did find that married Mary Hannah, and that gentleman was John Kavanaugh. We find him in the 4th Regiment of the New Jersey Continental Line, and we also at the beginning had found him on a casualty list, which encourages quite a bit. And meaning us, I'm meaning the folks at the Historical Society who I've collaborated with on this research. I would, having worked for the state for many years, I would spend time at my lunch hour to collect answers to questions that had been left on my back porch by my neighbor, Ann Garrison, and would type them up and put everything in the chronological order. And eventually we had over 100 pages of primary source material regarding Allentown. Bob Craig encouraged us to do that. Other historians encouraged us. And I was so encouraged that I went back to school, to Rutgers Camden, and got a degree in public history, a master's degree that allowed me to go forward with my research. But my problem was I kept on the same subject, which was the true identity of Molly Pitcher, much to my regret, as this program will hopefully show. Here in the history of New Jersey by John O. Rahm, we find an account, and oh, by the way, the prior source of Reverend Swain's speech was Sarah Stafford, who claimed that the Molly and John and the Hannah family had lived across from the Presbyterian church that I showed previously. And Rahm says, and goes on for pages, again, in that same type of vernacular speaking of who knew whom and related to this individual and that individual, again mentions the Irish Redemptioners. She seems to be inflexible on whether they're part of a Rogers contingent that came over from Northern Ireland, or now in this situation, she's taken those same names and applied them to the Jackson family, and says that a woman by the name of Jane Jackson, known as Ginny, had led Washington's troops, in particular Hugh Mercer in the van, to the Battle of Princeton on that famous night march out of Trenton. Goes on to explain how she got to know Jonathan Richmond's wife, who was the tavern keeper, which was headquarters at the time, and how she got to lead the troops. But again, similar to the Molly Pitcher story and Mary Hannah, I have not been able to find any truth to this. Although the biographer of Hugh Mercer picks it up and mentions it in his account there. Here's an image of Ginny. This is from one of the wonderful etchings. I believe this one's from Frank Stockton's Stories of New Jersey, that wonderful book of some of it fantasy, some of it truth, I guess. He seems to go out on a limb, or he tends to conflate Ginny with Molly, which essentially I will do, or I have done, and I'll get to that at the very end. But I believe that we're dealing with possibly the same personage here, if at all. And then Sarah's prize possession. This is the showstopper, guys. This flag, she claimed, flew on the Bonhomme Richard in that famous battle in the North Sea with the Serapis of John Paul Jones, fighting tooth and nail against the British in this battle. She claimed her father, who was a lieutenant in the Navy, he did receive a pension, that he then had rescued the flag before this is the flag that flew on the Bonhomme Chart just before it had sunk, after Paul Jones and his crew had taken possession of the Serapis. And then it was later given to him by a Marine committee in honor of his service. She and her family for the rest of the century seemed to have, 19th century, seemed to have made quite a bit out of this flag and claiming its authenticity. It had only 12 stars, and it did have the 13 stripes. Now, there's some truth to this. It seems that Sarah, who was remotely related to the person that would eventually take possession of the flag and who Lieutenant Stafford would serve under. And that, here's the image of John Paul Jones, which most of you are familiar with. Here's the Serapis and Bonhomme Richard close together and in that immortal fight. But her father actually was related to John Barry by way of his father, who married Barry's mother later in life. So therefore, guess they are somewhat related. But because of that relationship, Stafford does serve on Barry's ship as a lieutenant, and is released in 84 at the end of the war. Now, it is so convoluted, and I've tried to explain it before, but not only was there a close friendship between these gentlemen, but Lieutenant Stafford, James B. Barrett Stafford, actually did perform a service. He took, under the direction of the Congress at that time, a letter to Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence had become, he was imprisoned on his way to the Netherlands to become ambassador, and he was in the Tower of London. And incredibly, Stafford was able to carry this letter to him, deliver the letter, return with the aid of Barry. They were both from Wexford, Ireland, familiar with the terrain. Therefore, they were able to travel in this manner. And this is a transcript of a recommendation from Barry himself for a job, or for Stafford himself for a job, signed by Barry. Here's Lawrence, Henry Lawrence, who was eventually released in exchange with Cornwallis, of all people, towards the end of the war. So Sarah Smith was the daughter of Lieutenant James Barrett Stafford. Stafford would depart in 1838 after moving to Trenton, after living in Allentown for a long while. And here's her heritage. She claims it goes all the way back to the Smith family, and this shows the relationship between Catherine Barry and Barry's father. I believe his name was Howard. Here's an image of another image of the gentleman. It said he wore his hair in a queue and was dressed in colonial garb up till as late as 1818. And then Sarah lived on South Warren Street. She lived on two different addresses. I believe the one at 344 is probably where the Cogen plant is. Everyone's familiar in Trenton with that location. She lived there for a while, and they say even then they said it was a bit of a slum area, although her house was well kept. And she turned it into a historical museum of all things. Not only did she just proudly display the flag, but there were other items. And this is actually, this is just after her death. Her brother there produces this catalog of all the items there. And just to give an example, I think there were like 128 items. And some of these items might be at the Rutherford B. Hayes Museum, strangely enough, in Fremont, Ohio. If anybody's willing to take a trip out there, if you're out that area, you might want to look up the collection of Sarah Stafford here. But some of these items did make it over there. But here's the flag itself. She claimed that she had the cutlass of Paul Jones and then the musket. And she also, I think she said that same musket or another musket was used in the Battle of Bunker Hill by her grandfather, and it just goes on. A maternal grandfather, it just goes on and on. It's just almost too much to take in. And here's her sister-in-law, Samuel's wife, with the flag itself. And it was well traveled. As I said, the family made quite a fortune off of this for many years. And but no one, especially of all people, Hutchinson had no faith in this woman. Here's the woman who's given the wrong name here. It's not Mrs. H. Stafford. It was would have been Mrs. Samuel B. Stafford. But here's a better image of the flag itself in all its glory. It was eventually presented to the Smithsonian, and it was not until the 1930s or so that the Smithsonian determined it to be a fake. But early on, there was some hint of difficulty with the flag. It seems that a gentleman back in just a few years after Sarah's passing in 1881, which was one of the largest funerals in Trenton at that time because everyone who knew her. She had a way of cultivating friends in high places. She famously donated her money to the Civil War cause, yeah, it just goes on and on. But she really did have a true heart. She eventually taught school when she moved to Trenton. Her and her father both taught school of girls. It was at a school of girls and of colored children. So they were paid for that. And then when she went to Washington in earnest to lobby for these separate bills to her benefit, in 1846, she taught a school, I believe was located at the Naval Yard there. And so she was well respected, but it seems like it wasn't until she got to a certain age, again, as I said, after her mother passed away in 1861, she got closer to 70 or so, and then all of this came out about she knew this one and she knew that one. Nobody could be more patriotic than her. At times, even calling out individual families and claiming that their families were loyalist and trying to shame them. I mean, this is why I really wanted to give this talk, because it started to ring in my ears that I had heard this tune before when following current political events. And I believe I'm getting close to the end. And yes, I am. Thank you. Is that good enough, guys? Did I make up for Paul's?
You did a
Paul's time?
fantastic, you did a fantastic job. If you don't mind, just stop sharing your screen. We'll head over to question and answer.
Okay, great.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. It's really interesting to, see how this research can kind of just create more rabbit holes and then bring up new questions. And this was absolutely no different. For folks who have questions for our presenters, please feel free to drop them in the chat or into the Q&A box. I did have a question just to kind of get us started. Both of your presentations really highlight how memory is both an active choice that we make, but also subconscious. And what I was thinking about was, in terms of like broad themes or topics, what did you think were the main priorities for folks in the 19th century when they were trying to memorialize the American Revolution?
I believe it was lineage, definitely lineage. I mean, I have a room full of, at the library here in Allentown, of genealogy material. And it's so many books and that people have relied on because they all wanted to prove that they were of a Mayflower, that they came over on the Mayflower. They were so concerned about status. And I mean, even the reference to the prejudice against the Stafford family, because they were Irish, which didn't make them any less, I guess, at the time, you know, it's just lineage to me. That was the main focus, and to see who could actually it was a contest to see who could outdo the other in regards to knowledge. And you read those notes in these historical society tomes that we tended to travel through, and you see all these references to like, oh well, I need to correct that, or you need to correct that, and it goes back and forth. Sometimes it gets fairly ugly.
Interesting.
I think, you know, that's for, you know, for sure and important and, you know, true. I'll add another kind of motivation, I think, is the, you know, the environmental, which is both physical environmental, but also sort of social environmental changes. That's what I find, you know, I'm not, this is not an original thought from me. Others point this out, you know, you think nationwide, you know, you think about, right, the people like Henry Ford and the Rockefellers who funded all these things, and their big effort was basically, they felt that what their industries were destroying was worthy of preservation, right? You know, as the automobiles or oil, you know, was changing the world. And so this curious way that they were kind of, you know, the ones making it happen at the same time wanted to save it. And so what's cool to me is you can see it right here on our New Jersey scale, the Wallace House, you know, one of it, you know, I said that the asbestos roof, it was a gift, a personal gift of John's Manville. And we have the letter where Mr. Manville, right, just only, you know, a few miles away, and, you know, his new company town was saying, oh, I'll send, you know, I'd love to give you an asbestos roof. And the president of the society writes back, oh, I wish I could accept this gift for my own house. Ah, this is great. You know, I'm so excited to see this. But, you know, I know I see people, you know, group from the Heritage Trail Association here, and the historical they look after was part of the Calco company, Cyanamid, and they also appear in this early correspondence as supporters of the project. So, you know, definitely there's this sense that we're losing something, and as a result, we need to kind of save it elsewhere. And at the risk of getting too on the nose, when I share in our current rehabilitation projects, the U.S. Historic Preservation Fund, it's the offshore drilling is where that money comes from. But just to explain, right, that's, you know, the notion of our present arrangement, the federal government today. Well, when we take a non-renewable resource, we kind of invest it back into something else that could be lost. And so, you know, it's that's an interesting motivator too. One among many others, but.
Yeah, I know that was a very broad question. So thank you both for those answers. And I almost feel like we could do a whole nother presentation just kind of diving into each of those. But we do have a couple of questions that are coming in through the chat and our QA box. The first one is, what are some differences between how historical preservation has been and is being done in New Jersey compared with other states such as Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia?
I would know.
Fair.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I would say maybe, I don't know if, you know, just needs further examination or study, but I although we have these figures, right? You know, John's explored some of them here. You know, I'm introducing some of them. You know, we have no one big underwriter. You know, like say you think of obviously Colonial Williamsburg and this, you know, John D. Rockefeller Jr. kind of providing it. And and maybe sort of relating to what I'm kind of exploring here too. I always say our home rule in our government of New Jersey also applies to our historic preservation of New Jersey, right? But I mean that in the sense, as you know, what happens here, right? You know, you didn't have some kind of master strategy. You know, you had a group say, all right, we want to preserve this house, we'll go here. Kate McFarland says, well, I didn't want to preserve a house in Somerville. I wanted to preserve my house in Rocky Hill. So I'm splitting off and I'm going to form my own group. And so, yeah, you know, maybe that's kind of a characteristic of our historic preservation traditionally New Jersey, it's, it's been individuals who kind of, that's what I meant when I said a sort of a resonance for anyone who feels, my gosh, why can't we all just get along and work together like they used to? Well, I don't know quite when they used to was, because especially as John's pointing out, I think we're actually a lot friendlier with each other today, working across these places than we may have been in the past. So yeah, I think that might be a factor there.
I think that's kind of hopeful, knowing that, in the past there were all these disagreements and we were still able to preserve as much as we did. And as you said, things might be getting friendlier, which is always wonderful. Kind of keeping in that preservation line, but this will apply for both. What influence did William Stryker have on 19th century preservation activities of both of your locations? Wait, and as I said both, I think this will be another one for Paul. My apologies, I misread the question.
Okay. Yeah. William Stryker is someone I need to understand better. And in fact, the Old Dutch parsonage where I'm sitting right now was once in the ownership of Peter Stryker, which I know is part of that extended family. And so I need to sit down and get all these relationships straight sometime. I don't know of any specific involvement actually, though, that he had with the Wallace House or Rockingham. I think I do see the Stryker names on some of the later membership rolls, but not in any unexpected or particularly strong leadership ways. And it is kind of interesting. I don't know the other story that just preparing this made me want to see is where the Washington Society, that preserved the Ford Mansion, where they fit in to kind of this other group that decided in 1896 in Newark, oh, we need we need to start something new. As you can tell, also the name, the Revolutionary Memorial Society, when this organization formed, I think they definitely had the idea that the Wallace House may be kind of our kickoff project, but we will become kind of a statewide preservationist group. And I don't think that that never really happened. Not to say that preserving the Wallace House in itself was not a huge accomplishment, but they never really were able to get beyond their goal to become as their grand kind of name suggests, their whole existence was devoted to the preservation of the Wallace House. I'm going long to basically say to the particular question about William Stryker. I've not yet identified any specific interest, although these are all the same people, who are all kind of in conversation with each other around his time.
Yeah, and that's interesting context to have, around the whole situation.
Stryker did mention the name of Bond, and he was definitely aware of the Hannah story too. So
Okay.
and he included it in his history of Monmouth. So this woman was very successful, especially in the latter part of the 19th century when these gentlemen were doing their research and writing. E.M. Woodward was another one that she had believing the story. In fact, even in his history of Burlington, he had a little insert in his book there from an ordnance master from Carlisle, PA, that swore that Molly Pitcher was Mary Hannah from Allentown, New Jersey. Really?
It's it feels like a story that will never end. But again, when you find the answer, please let us know. We will be very curious. We have time for just one more question. So I'm going to take one from the chat, which is, do you think our approach to memory versus history has changed since the 19th century? Or are many of the same interests, motivations, and approaches still powerful?
All right, I'll go. I believe it's changed to the extent that we are now able to determine there's so much information available, so many sources, and the digital has just taken it to a whole nother level. I mean, and I'm going back to it's different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century, if I may dare to say. And I can imagine it's just tremendous now. As far as the focus, it depends on your political beliefs, I guess. And that's sad. And that is truly sad because it's not just about fact anymore. It's about who you're going to believe. And I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. Paul, do you have a response?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think and these are all obviously generalizations, and as in the past and the present, there's no one rule that guides everything. I definitely say in general, what we've had is the shift for this colonial revival era, largely white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans nationwide, New Jerseyans, in our scope of study. They're interested in, these kind of shrines of great men, often in particular. And the real motivation is that somehow you can learn something virtuous out of it. What I do see curious is kind of, the new sort of real interest, like sort of civics, right, or however it's termed, is in many ways kind of sort of taking the same old approach, extending the diversity and variety perhaps of the people we study. But basically what's happened is in an era where it was a segregated experience, as was the nation. It was a segregated historic preservation. Now you have, I'm not saying by any means resolved or solved, but much more diverse participation, and a lot of the new interest in preservation really comes from what has been the so-called underrepresented people in preservation have taken new subjects, new interests, and that's what I mean by the landmark and landscape. Now they weren't interested in the farm because who cares from their perspective? That just wasn't a subject. If we lost that evidence, well, we weren't looking for it anyway. But the other part that I think is changing, and maybe this is from the 20th into the 21st century, the social stuff side is the physicality. And one of the things I'm excited working with on our present rehabilitation law says is interest in sustainable materials and traditional techniques, and that's kind of what the asbestos roof and all. They were looking at, hey, we want a cool place to visit, and now we're kind of seeing these benefits, even if you don't care about the history, that preserving material kind of has social and cultural benefits, and preserving landscapes have community benefits. So yeah, I think that's a new kind of technical shift. It's not just about preserving something so you can look at it. It's preserving it so it can continue to live as part of a community.
Absolutely, and a lot of good food for thought there. Well, I'm afraid our time is up, so I'll say another huge thank you to our two presenters today. We are so grateful to have you with us, and thank you to everyone who attended. If you enjoyed what you heard today, we hope to see you at our conference on October 30th. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday.
Thank you. Bye.